Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Too Short a Season, which is episode 15 of season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video, I cover the episode Too Short a Season. So, Too Short a Season is the episode where the Enterprise gets a visit from Admiral Jameson, who's put in command of this mission to return to a planet where Federation hostages are taken, a planet that he negotiated for the free with the particular people of this planet. He negotiated the release of hostages some years prior, and the Admiral is like in his, I believe in his 90s or maybe upper hundreds. He's a very elderly person who's disabled and dying from a disease, but then all of a sudden starts getting healthier and younger, and eventually it's discovered that he took a alien de-aging potion that is rare and many had thought not to exist, but it works for him. However, because of the mission, he wanted to be really young and strong, so he took too much and it starts killing him. And when they go to free the hostages, they realize that the leader that they're negotiating with is actually the one who took the hostages, and he did it for revenge for Jameson, because apparently last time Jameson was there, he gave weapons to them in order to free the hostages, but he also gave weapons to their enemy as his version of evening things out. And so the people who run the planet blame Jameson for the 40-year civil war that followed because of that, and so they want to kill Jameson as revenge. And so eventually, after a failed attempt to rescue the hostage, they beam down Jameson, who is now a young man, and the guy doesn't believe that it's actually Jameson, so Picard and everyone have to argue and convince him that he is, and once they do, he's satisfied as he watches Jameson die in agony from the weird alien de-aging stuff that he took. And so the hostages are then released. So this is a very strange episode. It does feel out of place for Next Generation. It feels out of place for season 1 in particular. It has sort of a darker tone than I think a lot of season 1 does. And it focuses mainly on guest characters. Like Admiral Jameson is clearly the main character of this episode, and he's the main focus, and the main focus is this backstory of him and this planet, where he gave weapons in order to free the hostages, and then gave weapons to the enemies of the people who took the hostages, and how he's trying to sort of make up with that and deal with the consequences of doing that. And so, Karnas, that's the name of the leader on the planet, Karnas, who takes the hostages. So, it felt weird. Like, all of our main characters, like Picard and Riker and Tasha Yar and Worf and Troy, like, they were all basically side characters. Now, Picard was probably the biggest side character. Like, he was definitely involved with the main plot. But it was Admiral Jameson's episode, and him and his wife and Karnas. The focus was more on them, and I had no connection to it. And plus, like, it was all about this backstory of these things that he did 40 years ago, which of course was being told about in this episode, not shown, and all the history and what Jameson is and what's going on with this episode, we're all being told about. We're not being shown. In fact, I believe that is a quote from or similar to what the director of this episode said, that this episode was sit and tell and not show and tell. That he prefers stories be, shown, that you show the audience what's going on, what happened, and he believed that this episode was all about telling and not showing. And others involved in this episode describe it as very wordy, very talky. I didn't. I don't know, because that's not what came to my mind when I was watching the episode. I didn't think it was wordy or talky. I did think it was a lot of tell not show, though. A lot, and I felt very, very disconnected from everything that was going on, because it was following this character we were just introduced to that wasn't fleshed out very well and thus didn't care about. And it was delved deeply into this backstory that they're just telling us about, that we had no prior knowledge. That has absolutely nothing to do with anything we've seen on the show before, so I did not care. I felt incredibly disconnected. And then you're supposed to have this emotional punch by Jameson taking this de-aging medicine and it's killing him, but I don't care, because I don't know who this character is. I never cared about him, and this episode gave me nothing to care. He just seemed like an asshole, really, who comes aboard shoving Picard around saying, "This is my mission," and then we find out that he sold weapons to both sides and was the cause of this war. And that he's like ordering Picard around and ordering an armed invasion which could get all the hostages killed. So, and he's being a dick to his wife, because he's like talking about how he was gonna give he didn't tell her that he took this de-aging stuff, which of course really pissed her off. And he said, "Oh, I got enough for you as well, so you could also be young again." But then I took that dose as well to make myself super young, which was obviously making him sick. So he was a dick to his wife. He was a dick to Picard. He was a dick to this whole society by giving them weapons and causing more war. He was a dick to the hostages by, almost getting them killed by invading it. And so why would I care when he's like dying and suffering? This episode gave me the opposite reasons to care about this character. I completely and utterly do not. And yet this whole episode hinges on this character, about you caring about him, about how at the end he dies. It's supposed to be tragic and they play this sad music, but I'm like, okay, so okay, he's dead. Whoop-de-doo. Like I care. and it focuses entirely on him, and all the characters we do care about got really nothing to do. And on top of that, the makeup of this character is terrible. So, because Admiral Jameson is de-aging, they obviously hired an actor who's young, who is the age that Jameson is at the time of his death after de-aging a bit, so like in his 20s or 30s. And so they hired a young actor, but he was playing him as an old man, so they put all this, makeup on him to make him look older, and it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. And he's in this really silly like wheelchair, which apparently they paid like ridiculous amount of money for the chair, and it didn't even work properly, and it kept falling apart on set. Sounds like an absolute disaster. And it didn't even need to have that chair, like, and the way he's like talking as an old man is like, combined with the terrible makeup, is actually bad acting as well. Where he's trying to, when he talks like an old man, he like makes his voice really really whispery and really, "Yes, Picard, yes, yes, Picard, I can command this mission. I hope you understand." Like, I couldn't follow it. Like, it threw me out of the story. Just how terrible this acting, combined with how terrible the makeup was, combined. And this is the character that this episode's trying to get us to focus on, who I have no attachment to whatsoever. Now, the one bright thing I will say is, I thought the character of his wife is good. I thought that actress did a good job, and I thought she was portrayed pretty well, but she wasn't the main character. And then Karnas, of course, he was good at being an asshole, which was the point of it. Now, this storyline with the hostages and the arms deal was an obvious commentary on, or attempt, I should say, to comment on the Iran-Contra controversy, which was actually unfolding right around the time this episode made. So it was first in the news and exposed in 1986, and this episode was released in 1988. But Oliver North's trial, which I actually remember watching as a kid, like, I never understood what the Iran-Contra thing was until I was much, much older, in my 20s. But I remember when I was like 9, 10 years old, seeing Oliver North and hearing the name Oliver North a lot. So I was already familiar with Oliver North, even if I didn't learn the context of why he was infamous till much later. And the Trials was in 1989, which was after this episode came out. So it was still an ongoing controversy that was still fresh in the public's mind. And I'm not going to attempt to explain the Iran-Contra controversy, because I just read about it myself and I still don't really understand the ins and outs. I do believe there is a situation where they agreed to give Hezbollah terrorists who took hostages, American hostages, they gave them weapons for the hostages in exchange. And apparently they were like, instead of saying, here's a whole bunch of weapons, now release all the hostages, they were doing it one at a time. They were like, all right, here's a little bit of weapons, release one hostage. All right, here's some more weapons, now release another hostage. And it was going on for a long time. And it was actually, apparently more hostages were taken at the time, and some speculate that they took more hostages to make up for the ones that they released. So apparently it was a very huge debacle. But the main thrust of the Iran-Contra controversy was the fact that they were selling weapons to Iran and then using it to fund right-wing militias in Honduras to overthrow the legitimate left-wing government of Nicaragua. Sorry, I didn't pronounce that quite correctly. I do apologize. But yeah, so that was essentially the gist of it. And so I don't find this episode a particularly good commentary on that. It's just like, it's also similar because he gave the enemy weapons to free hostages. Like, that's pretty much where the similarities end. Like, the Jameson character doesn't seem anything like Oliver North or any other people involved with the controversy. Or like Reagan, because it's not like the Federation were like selling weapons to this alien planet and using it to overthrow another legitimate government on a different planet, because that's not how the Federation works. And especially now, Roddenberry would never let the writers get away with something like that. So I don't know, it's just like they're trying to evoke that image without not saying anything meaningful about it, without not having any meaningful allegory or meaningful message. It's just like, this is also a situation where he gave weapons to hostage takers to free the hostages, and look how bad that is. Look how much that went to bite him on the ass. What a terrible thing. Which, I mean, I will admit I found that somewhat interesting, and that is like somewhat interesting of a message to have, but as a Iran-Contra commentary, it's really weak. And I really feel like they could have done a much better job. And plus, like how they show Karnas at the start of the episode saying, these rebel faction took the hostages, and then later we find out it actually was Karnas who took the hostages. He's just lying. Like, I don't know. That seemed kind of like a waste. Like, why do that extra step? Why have him lying and pretending like he's there to get the Federation hostages back for them when really he's the one that took them? And since Jameson knew what actually happened, he should have known that Karnas would want to kill him and would blame him for the war that apparently they fought a civil war for 40 years. Now, one thing I do like, however, is how Picard, when he gets involved, he tries because Karnas, of course, is trying to shove the blame entirely to Jameson. Like, you should have just given us weapons and not the enemy weapons. It's your fault. But Picard's like, did you think of negotiating a peace? In all the 40 years, did you think, hey, maybe we shouldn't fight, maybe we shouldn't go to war, maybe it's not worth going to war over, maybe we should try to get, and they did make it sound like he was the aggressing side, that the other side would have been amendable for peace talks, but he was the one who was being non-negotiable and being completely stubborn, and for him to shove the blame, saying it's all Jameson's fault, is shirking his own responsibility, because Jameson didn't tell him to fight the war for 40 years and not try to negotiate the peace. That was his hatred that led him to do it. So I totally agree with Picard there, and I like how Picard did point that out and shove that in his face, and the episode did sort of point out how hypocritical this Karnas guy was being, and of course, that he was blaming everything on Jameson and not taking any self-responsibility, which is something one of these corrupt dictators would do. So that part rang true, and I did kind of like that. And I guess it was supposed to be, as I said, it was supposed to be seen as poetic justice when Jameson died at the end in agony. But as I said, this episode didn't do enough to get me to care about the character. And even though the backstory and history was interesting, his interesting concept, they didn't do enough to develop it to really earn that moment. And yeah, so that's basically what this episode is. It was, and apparently behind the scenes there was Maylish, Roddenberry's lawyer, apparently was trying to rewrite the script and almost snuck it into his upserts, his little things, and almost stuck it into the script, which is a huge violation of WGA regulations, because he's not a writer, he's a lawyer, and so they've threatened to sue him over this, which they very well could have, and so they, but things were calmed down, but apparently this is one of the worst situations. So I do believe that he was trying to insert Wesley in this episode, because apparently he loved Wesley and tried to insert him into everything. So yeah, that tracks. That's someone who is just a sleazy lawyer and has no writing ability ever at all, is the one who's who loves Wesley and wants him to be in the show more. That tracks for me. But as it is, because apparently they, fixed the problem, took his, rewritings out. Wesley doesn't appear in this episode at all. So, there's that. But you were trying to look for something positive about this episode. There's always that. So anyway, first of all, I want to thank my Patreon supporters for supporting my channel. It's very much appreciated. It helps the channel thrive. Really in debt to everyone. So we have Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Manijester, Joel Lavalles, Alessandro Miguelesio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal Howells. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So we have a couple of patron comments for this episode. First comment is from Brandon Neal Howells, who says, "Too short a season, too long an episode. TNG's bad update of A Private Little War. Where do I start? The awful makeup on the actor playing Jameson, the awful acting, the $10,000 wheelchair which was made for the Admiral and wasn't usable. Why won't Admiral Jameson look people in the eye when he's speaking? His makeup is too heavy, which is probably why he speaks like a Klingon. This episode was meant to be an analogy for the Iran-Contra affair, but is too heavy-handed for my taste. Does taking a de-aging potion automatically restore your libido? I wish I could tell you, but I think not. Why does Picard agree to go down with Jameson's first away team and Riker does not even protest? Why do the away team decide to follow Jameson's map of the tunnels, which is 50 years out of date? Most worrying of all to me is why don't we see Ambassador Hawkins and the other hostages? Without their appearance, a lot of the urgency is lost. Mark Jameson is a very selfish person, and I do not feel at all sorry for him. The actor playing Karnas also played Korax in The Trouble with Tribbles. Right, the guy who is that Korax, the dude who is like the Enterprise shouldn't be hauling garbage, it should be hauled away as garbage. Maybe, I don't know. But anyway, Brandon answers my question for me. It says he was the one who said the Enterprise should be hauled away as garbage. Should be hauled away as garbage. Why did Jameson's wife want him buried on Morden 4, though? 3 wrist cuts out of 10. Yeah, there's a lot. Brennan asks a lot of very good, poignant questions here. For me, yeah. When Riker didn't complain when Picard said he was beaming down, that threw me off too, because that was in later seasons it's not that big of a deal, but in season 1 they made a huge deal where Riker would freak the fuck out whenever Picard suggested he was going to beam down. And here he was going in the middle of a battle situation to rescue the hostages, and Riker says not one word about it. Now, to be fair, Picard does in a way that kind of shuts him up. Picard is just like, yes, I'm beaming down number 1, and he runs straight to Tremors Pride. He's like, energized. He's like, he gives him no time to argue. So maybe part of that, I think, and Riker's just like he's about to say something. So maybe that's why, but still, it does seem weird that even afterwards, he doesn't dress Picard down. It's like, how dare you put yourself in danger or something. Doesn't say anything about it. And why did the away team decide to follow Jameson's map of the tunnels, which is 50 years out of date, is also a really good question. It's also something I was thinking about, because Data's like, oh, it's not this way, there's a wall here, and Jameson's like, no, nonsense, I know these tunnels like the back of my hand. And yeah, you were here 50 years ago. And Data has a fucking tricorder, and he can scan the whole area, and he tells you exactly what it was. So, first of all, Jameson's being obtuse. Secondly, why the fuck are they following him when they know he's wrong? Anyway, yeah. And why did Jameson's wife want him buried on Morden 4? They just threw that in. This episode has so much telling that shit. Just threw that out. The wife wanted him buried there. Why? Was that his wishes? I don't know. This is his shame. This is his death. He did a horrible thing by giving weapons to hostage takers, which is absolutely against everything of what, not let alone the Prime Directive, but everything that the Federation stands for. And she wants him buried here at the location of his greatest shame and his horrible death. It doesn't really make sense to me, personally. I mean, I thought it would make sense of Korax or Korax. What is his name? Karnas. Sorry, Korax is the dude from Trouble with Tribbles. It's garbage. Karnas. It would make more sense if Karnas wanted him buried there to sort of yes, the old warrior or whatever. But no, it was his wife. Why? I don't know. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky. And it says, another terrible, god-awful episode. This episode was both boring and irritating to me. Seriously, an aging admiral gets a Fountain of Youth potion and ages younger, and he does still because he feels he wants to... Oh, he does it because he wants to be a young macho man. This is dumb and boring. I didn't buy the character or his motivation at all, so my rating is a 2 out of 10. Also fair. So my rating for Too Short a Season out of 10 is going to be a 4. Poor. I think I went into this review beforehand thinking I would give this episode a 5, but as I was talking through it, and of course reading some of the Patreon comments, kind of talked me down to a 4. Because I don't think that this is one of the worst episodes ever. Like, when I think of bad, terrible episodes of Season 1, this one doesn't come up. This is more of like a forgettable episode of Season 1. Like a very forgettable, oh yeah, this episode exists. And as I mentioned before, it feels very out of place. It's just atypical, but not in a good way, like Conspiracy, but in a bad way, because you just don't care. You don't care about anything that's going on. Now, we'll give it a 4, not something lower like my Patreon comments did, because I do think some of the aspects of the tragedy of him taking this pill to grow younger, and the tragedy of him selling arms and dealing with the consequences of his actions in the past is interesting. It's just not executed particularly well, and they didn't do enough to get us to care about it. But it's an interesting concept, and it did have me engaged somewhat in it, so I wouldn't say this is the worst episode ever, but yeah, 4 out of 10 for me for this one. So that is it for my review of Too Short a Season. I shall be back with another TNG review next Monday for When the Bow Breaks. And then the following Wednesday, I will be back for another review of Ahsoka. And then on Friday, another TNG Classic Season 1 episode review with large, ugly bags of mostly water with home soil on Friday. So thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel to keep up with all of that, and I also do many other videos on shows like Star Trek and many other shows as well, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.